Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and good afternoon. Welcome to this press conference from the 17th World Economic Forum on the Middle East and North Africa. It's our number 10 here in Jordan, where you're joining us live from the Dead Sea. Thank you for joining us here in the room. Thank you for joining us on the live stream, whether you're on the website or watching on a social media channel of your choice. Thank you for tuning in. The press conference you're joining is dedicated to the question, what more can be done to drive gender diversity in the Middle East? Clearly, if you followed the program so far, or if you're generally are concerned with the Middle East, you know there's a lot that needs to be done. So we try to answer this question here today. Luckily, we have a fantastic panel to discuss that question, find answers for that question. To my immediate left, I'm joined by Norma Taki, who's a partner at PwC and also the diversity and inclusion leader of the company. And to her left, we're joined by David Suarez, who's also a partner and the people and organization leader for the Middle East. This press conference is also dedicated to a launch of a wonderful report. And as you can see, both of them have the report with them. And don't be shy, hold it in the camera, let people see what you've done. But Norma, let's get the first question to you. Why did you do this report, and why are you, as PwC, concerned with answering this question and looking at that topic?
Okay, thank you. So I think we all realize that the global commitment to gender diversity is growing. The body of evidence that's showing the contribution of diverse teams into the workforce is also driving both public and the private sector to take note and take action. One statistic which baffled me, which is the numbers that support this. So globally, countries stand to lose around $160 trillion in wealth due to the difference in lifetime earnings between men and women. That's staggering, right? In a recent study that we've done where we benchmarked D&I initiatives, we found that approximately 87% of all leaders, corporate leaders, think that this is a priority. Now, we think one of the reasons for that is the war on talent. The youth look at companies and see how diverse they are, what are their equal opportunities, and what are they doing on this conversation. Governments and regulations have played a more part of it. So what does that mean from a MENA region? We all know this from a global perspective. In our view, a significant opportunity. In our view, the numbers also support it. So if you look at the workforce in the Middle East region, 25% of that workforce is women only. That's the lowest number across the world. The other number that's interesting is that we lose in the MENA region a staggering $575 billion every year because of the social and legal barriers of stopping women from contributing into the workforce.
Repeat that number, because it's beyond imagination.
It's almost. $575 billion a year in the MENA region. Now, the opportunity is that you can stand to gain by just increasing the number of women in the workforce from now to 2025 at another 2.5 trillion into the workforce. So I think that those numbers really, really support it. We've also seen how some of the governments across the region have really made a difference, and that's shown. So if you look at the UAE, 66% of the public workforce are women, and that's because of enforced action, affirmative action that the government has taken. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has an ambitious goal of having 30% of the workforce by 2030. And this is why we decided, let us look at what our women across the region are doing, and we've embarked on this survey. So this survey, it was about women in the workplace. It's an index as part of a global index, a series of related global labor market indices that we do, and we focused our survey on surveying 3,000 women across the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, across the UAE, and in Egypt as well. And the results were very interesting. I'll let David discuss these.
Yeah, what a nice bridge, David, to let you share with us a little bit. What were the key findings what did you hear from these 3,000?
Right. So first, I guess the question might be why did we pick those three countries, right? I mean, I would say that this is a bit of a sample, right? Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, large economies. You could say beacons in the region as well, and fairly representative. It's also true that if you look at the Middle East from the outside, some people might just put it all under one bag, but in practice, we're talking about very different countries with very different dynamics, right? And that's the reason why we wanted to pick different data points. In the UAE, if you look at just participation of women in the workplace, they've actually done a fair amount. You know, it used to be in the 1990s, it was in the low 20s. It's now in the low 40s%, which is actually quite good when you think about it. Saudi Arabia has gone from about 14% in 1990 to around 23%, 23% last year. And of course, the dynamics are quite different. In Saudi Arabia, for instance, I think there's and pretty much across the region, there's a need to wean ourselves away from oil. We need to diversify from a industrial perspective. And there's just a huge opportunity there to tap into nearly 50% of the workforce, which is not tapped into, right? Egypt, on the other hand, you've got a very different dynamic, a very large country where there's been, I think, a lot of progress when it comes to, at least from a legislative perspective, to try to bring women into parity with men. However, when you look at the growth or the progress that has been made, in 1990, the women participation in the workforce was around 21%. Now it's around 22%. So it really hasn't moved a lot, and we believe that's because there are certain social norms and cultural traits of that country that maybe are not as perhaps progressive as you might see in other countries around the region, and there's probably a further opportunity there to make additional progress, right? But in terms of the findings, right? Let me cut to the chase. I wanted to highlight just a couple things. One is that when we looked at pay gap perception, now one thing that I'd like to say is this was a study of perceptions, right? And we asked people, how do you feel about X, Y, or Z? And one of the questions we asked is, do you feel that there's a pay gap? And to be honest with you, the pay gap question was not really a real issue. Where the issue lies is around promotions, around progression, and what happens. So we asked a question, do you agree with the statement, my employer treats females equally to males when it comes to promoting from within? And we got basically that 61% of males agreed with that statement or strongly agreed with that statement versus 56% of females. And so you may say, okay, fine, I can accept that there's a slight difference, that men maybe see the world a little rosier. What's staggering here is that we're talking about nearly 50% of the respondents basically saying that it's not equal, okay, and that we're not putting that kind of opportunity out there for women. So that's one area that we looked at. The other one we looked at was about supporting women and supporting after returning to, or when returning to work after a career break, right? And we're talking about 55% of the male respondents agreeing with that statement versus 44%. So the difference, I think, there is greater. When you look at it, it's about 11 percentage points. But still, we have a long way to go. And those were some of the questions that we asked about businesses. When you look at the other two questions that we asked about government and government intervention, we asked a question about, are national programs actually delivering, or have they, are there in place, national programs to support women through their careers? And in the vast majority of cases, that is the case. So about 2/3 in the UAE, 64%, 60% in Saudi Arabia versus 48% in Egypt. So there are programs in place, yet we see that there's still probably more work to do. But I would say that the biggest finding around government intervention was whether the government should set targets for the private sector or not, which you could say can be more or less controversial. But the respondents unequivocally agreed, 2/3, so 66% of women and 65% of men who responded to that agreed that yes, there should be some government intervention in the private sector.
Thank you very much. And in all three countries that you looked at, just for our online audience, it's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it's the United Arab Emirates, and it's Egypt.
That is correct.
Did respondents equally kind of measure that government role? Because you mentioned the 2030 vision, you mentioned other programs. or was that different among these markets?
So they look. The perception is that the UAE, in particular, respondents in the UAE basically said that 64% of them agreed or strongly agreed that there are government programs in place to support women through their careers. So that was 64%, 60% in Saudi Arabia, and 48% in Egypt. Those were the responses.
Yeah, but the question around whether they wanted government intervention was equal across. I mean, it was quite interesting to see. And you can understand why you would have that support from the UAE and KSA, why the respondents would be like that, because you are seeing a lot of government intervention in this area, but it was across the board.
Mm. You mentioned initially the war on talent.
Yes.
And you mentioned the immense economic advantages that it brings to have a more diverse workforce. Why do the economies, the business in the region even need the government to drive home that point? What do you think is keeping business from realizing that potential without kind of the government nudging them, whether with quotas or not? As you mentioned, it's something that's being discussed.
So my personal view, and one of the recommendations that we say here, is that we have done a lot in terms of raising awareness and educating around this topic, whether it is from a public perspective or internally from a private sector, so inside the companies. But that's not moving the needle. That hasn't moved the needle globally. That hasn't moved the needle regionally either, because we're not holding people accountable for it. Okay, so while you raise awareness, you educate people, you need to hold accountable. So what are we going to do about this? Okay, so that unconscious bias and conscious bias in a lot of is not. People are aware of it, but they don't know they have to do something about it. So we think that there needs to be accountability around this. So you need to have measurable actions. You need to know what's happening. You need to get the data to know what's happening and drive that. And I think that's why the needle is not moved.
Mm. And are the governments able to lead that way, really? How optimistic are you about that?
So if you look globally, so if you look at the UK, when they started in 1974 and they included the Equal Act, that's moved the needle tremendously. And now you're talking about things like equal pay and legislating that in the UK. What we've seen here in the region, so if you take the UAE example, which I mentioned earlier, public sector contribution, because they've legislated that, is 66% is women,
yeah.
and a lot of them are in the leadership positions.
I think the answer to this problem really requires both government and private sector working together, right? The government has done a lot. If you look at the UAE in particular, 60% of women participation in the public sector. That's outstanding, right? But the average of the country is around 40%, which means that the private sector contribution is lower than that, obviously. So there's more that can be done. And I think it's both in terms of policy, it's legislation, but it's also making it easy. In particular, let me focus for a moment on in the private sector, right? Private sector is very wide. You've got companies that are, maybe S&P 500s or the equivalent here in the region, publicly traded, very large. But then you also have small and medium enterprises. When you're trying to build in flexibilities, for instance, around lengthening a paid or an unpaid leave, for whatever reason, maybe family reasons for men or women, doesn't matter. Financing that might be easier for a large company than for a small and medium enterprise. So I think the government needs to intervene to make that easy for companies, because otherwise, I don't care how good your intentions are, you cannot just regulate it, because at the end of the day, you could be inadvertently killing that profitability of that business, right? So there are ways of intervening, and I do think that it requires a very tight cooperation both between the public and the private sector.
Mm. You earlier mentioned some developments reaching back from the 90s to today, and that is definitely progress, as you described it. But if I think of an individual, that means basically the career span of a person. Do you, from the interviews you led, from the conversations you had, do you feel that the women in the workforce have the patience for progress at that speed, or would you say they are normal? Maybe you want
I think it's a question for Norma. I was going to answer, but
I'm interested to see his point of view, and I'll tell you.
Sorry for putting you on.
No, but I can look. You want me to give my point?
Go
ahead. So I think there needs to be. Rome wasn't conquered in a day, right? And here, it's not about just changing the regulation. It's about changing deep-seated mindsets, both for men, and I may add for women as well, right? And changing those mindsets is something that I think takes time. But I see change happening already. Let me give you an anecdotal example, right? Saudi Arabia, my proxy for women participation in the workplace is the hospitality sector, right? I mean, it used to be traditionally that financial services, healthcare, and education were the three sectors where women could really participate. And now we see other sectors opening up, and hospitality is one of them. I've been traveling to Saudi Arabia for the last 16, 17 years. And I remember 10 years ago, I would go to a hotel, and my proxy is the hotel reception, right? 10 years ago, you go to a hotel reception, and you would see a number of expats, men, helping you, check in and everything. 5 years ago, you would see some of those expat men with Saudi men. You say, okay, great, Saudization agenda is progressing, that's wonderful. Now what you see is Saudi men and women working side by side. You no longer see the expats, they're not there. You see Saudi men and Saudi women working together. And just last week, what was really interesting is there were only women when I checked into the hotel. And there was a young lady, I think she was a trainee. She had a little bit of trouble checking me in. And the person who helped her was the other Saudi lady. So again, I see change happening. I see that in the faces and in the people that I interact with, the Saudis in this particular example. And what's good about this anecdote also is the impact around self-reliance, right? And the fact that women can also help themselves. So again, to answer your question, I think there needs to be some patience. I think it'll vary depending on what generation you're talking about. I think millennials probably are less patient, and they should probably rock the boat a little bit more. But I see the needle moving, and that's, I think, positive.
I think we need to think about this, again, from a regional context. So is it moving fast enough? In my view, no. Are the new generation going to be patient? No. Which is why you see things happening, and companies, as they fight that war on talent, having to do a lot more, not just in this space, but in a lot of other. But if we take globally, I mean, this is a number that I find staggering every time, which is around pay gap globally. To close the pay gap, you need 200 years. Someone told me it's gone down to 270 globally, which is shocking. So from a region, if we bring it back to the regional perspective, I think we've seen tremendous growth from a UAE, and we'd expect to see that growth. So women don't have to wait as long as we went back to the 90s and the 70s, because progression is happening faster. When you take the example of Saudi Arabia only recently, and that is tremendous growth in a very, very short period of time. But are we going to expect the same growth rates as historical? No, it has to be much higher. And that's why we're highlighting, that's why it's on the agenda. Diversity is on the agenda of every global leader.
Thank you. So what's your message to the assembled leaders in public and private sector here at the Dead Sea?
Yeah, so we think that there's 4 initiatives that every organization needs to look at. As David mentioned earlier, we don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. There's a broad headlines and guidelines, but I think they're critical. And the first one, which as I mentioned earlier, is around raising awareness and education and making sure that you address the gender stereotypes that you have in your organization, and looking at trainings, whether conscious or unconscious. There's a lot of studies around, and a lot of people will push back and say, we don't know if that works, and there's evidence that it doesn't really work, but it's having these conversations and trickling them down and intervening at different touch points. So if you have annual appraisals, do you have that diversity lens on? So that's really, really important.
I would say also, and to me, one of the bigger levers for change is around flexibility, right? Flexibility in terms of work location, in terms of work hours. The idea is to get the job done, right? This also, by the way, came up. We launched another study last week on the workforce of the future for the Middle East. And we did a similar survey and so on. And what was surprising to us is that it wasn't just about digital skills or upskilling or preparing for new technologies and AI and all that sort of thing, which it was. But it was mostly about wellness. It was about work-life balance. It was about flexibility, it was about the gig economy and taking that to the limit, right? And this is not just for women, right? This is not an issue about women. It's an issue about the workforce in general. We need to move in that direction. There's absolutely no question about it. Then the other emphasis that I would make is around career breaks. You know, what happens when you take a long-term career break, maybe 5 or 10 years? Maybe you wait, whether you're a man or a woman, until your children are out of the house, are a little more independent, and then you want to go back to work. Well, markets can tap into that source of latent talent, right, that has been available and which needs to be made more available. So that would be, I think, another point. Third point that please.
I really like this point, and in everything that we're talking about from a diversity perspective, what I tell people is while we're looking at these initiatives for gender at the moment, these apply to generational issues as well. Whatever we're putting forward now, the younger generation wants it, whether male or female. So whether it's making sure there's no bias in the system, getting equal opportunities, or whether they're working flexibly. And I think that's a very important point. So whatever investment companies are doing right now, they're investing in the future of their workforce.
Yeah, the other thing that I would say is very important for companies to do is transparency, right? I mean, just look at the data, right? We talked about raising awareness, and that, there's messaging that has to come from the top for sure. But there's also about the data and get people look at, what type of percentages of women, for instance, are making it to the top, and what is the promotion rate and how that varies. This is objective data, and that I think can create a greater sense of urgency for decision makers and for the staff overall.
When you do all of that, you have to have accountability. So
right.
Organization, depending on the size, need to have someone that's looking after diversity and inclusion at the leadership level, and they need to make sure that they drive that. But accountability needs to happen at every single level, and that could take any form and shape as long as there is accountability.
Thank you very much. Before we open the floor for question and answer, I want to follow up on one of the points you mentioned, because I thought it was very interesting. You said, as it's moving the gig economy to the next level, are you saying, based on the learnings from this and the other report you mentioned, that the gig economy will kind of help create parity in the workplace?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So why do I say that? Okay. So the gig economy is predicated on the basis that it's not just about one job for life where you show up, and you punch in, and you punch out at the end of the day, and you do that 5 days a week. It's all about flexibility. It's about not necessarily having one boss, but being able to do 2, 5, 6 different things and going maybe from project to project. What both women and men want, particularly in certain stages of their career, particularly they want to start a family, is flexibility. And the gig economy will deliver that. We issued another study a couple of years ago where we talked about the 4 worlds of work in the future. We talked about the corporate world, the socially conscious world. We talked about the sustainable world. And one of the worlds that we had was around basically this gig economy. I'm not saying that everything is going to be gig economy, but certainly a good chunk of our economy can become that because of digitization, right? I mean, and the ability of people to communicate and to work remotely and we can do now remote printing. We don't even need to be at a manufacturing site because we can use 3D manufacturing, for instance. So the possibilities to me are endless, and I do hope that there will be a big injection around flexibility for both men and women, and that'll just, completely, help us realize our potential.
Thank you very much. I've taken up a fair share of the time we have. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, we have a microphone. If you could wait for that, so our online audience can also benefit from hearing the question.
Thank you very much for the interesting report. There's been a lot of studies that women still take a much larger share of the unpaid work and the care work than men do. And I think solving this is one of the key solutions to getting to better numbers. How do you think, what are things we can do to help men step up there?
I'm going to take this because this is an area I'm very passionate about, and I've been having a lot of debates around this. Paternity leave. Okay? I think what you need to do is to get to a level playing field. And to do that, you need to ensure, from a perception perspective, from an actual perspective, women and men are equal. What happens is, and we discussed this in a panel earlier today, and it's been discussed quite a lot, is Women lose when they take that career break to raise families. And most of the time, the onus falls on the women, whether regionally or globally. And it's not a regional issue. And to do that, there's been a lot of studies around how do you equalize that or try to get to a level playing field. And paternity leave is one of them. So you ask the guys to take time off to help and support and to take that career break. And so when they come back, they know what it's like. So I'm a big advocate of that.
I would also add another thing. You remember the He for She campaign, which is still quite active worldwide? I think we need more of that, to be honest with you. I've had a couple of situations where I felt, particularly when I'm invited to panels and everything, and all of a sudden I see myself as the one man sitting among 15 women. And I think to myself, is this how women sometimes feel in a boardroom, for instance? Because if that's the way you feel, this is the first time that I'm feeling the same thing. I feel a minority, I feel vulnerable. And I just think we need to do a lot more of that he for she, basically, and just looking at, how, what that means and then the implications around that. That aside, obviously, I think we probably need to, men need to change a lot more diapers. I've changed I have 4 children, so I've changed thousands of diapers in my life, but I think it needs to obviously go beyond that.
And one of the things we've been talking about is when I talked about raising awareness and education, that's across, that's to everyone. Level, age, gender, whatever it is, and men need to be on the same table having these conversations. And I think those will really significantly make an impact.
We have one question from the lady over there. Microphone is on its way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, the panel. Very interesting. Did the report look into the gender pay gap? This is a question I didn't get to. It's a topic that I think is not really coming up enough. We're talking more about women in the workforce. How do we get more senior women? How do we get more women partners on management, on the board, etc.? And the pay gap is horrendous, I think, to put it mildly. And I've been in investment banking 22 years, quite a long time. A lot of it in London. I'm sure you've all seen the reports about the London investment banks and the absolutely horrific pay gap. It is reality, and in some banks it's 30 and 40%. And having left investment banking in London and moved to Dubai a few years ago, many women actually leave the workforce because it doesn't pay off to work. Childcare is very expensive, and it doesn't make sense economically. While a man in the same job is getting paid quite a lot more. And if we do tackle the gender pay gap properly, it might actually incentivize women to stay and get up to management level, partner level, etc. Today, a lot of the on-the-ground conversation, which men not necessarily are part of, is it really worth me doing this? I'd love to, but you know what? I'm compromising my life, compromising the kids, taking on a lot of responsibility, a lot of travel. I'm not getting paid any more money. I can't even compensate the kids or anybody at home. We're getting another nanny to help. I'm not sure if this is just going to break my marriage and my kids, and not worth it. And this is a real conversation.
Sure.
That, I mean, not to name names, but a very, very large firm that I was
we'd love to hear the name of the firm.
Try to be politically correct here, but they were boasting about how they've got a lot more women in managerial levels, very senior managerial, and they've gone up to over 50% now. And when I did ask the question about did they close the gender pay gap, because I know this was quite bad in that firm. They said, no, we're working on this now. So basically, they've got women doing a lot more work for free. They're taking on a lot more responsibility for free, and that is that's not helping the problem. That's not helping women actually taking that step to say, okay, I can be financially independent potentially, or I can compensate for the extra work I'm getting. Did the survey not look at this?
So,
Never tackled.
so first of all, the survey just looked at our perception, right? We asked people, how do you, or what do you think about, do you agree with this statement? And in that sense, the pay gap, which was a bit of a surprise, honestly, when we looked at it, I said, why isn't this more of an issue? We asked the question explicitly. But I do think, how do you combat that? This whole pay gap thing is actually can get quite complex, right? Because it's about preferences, it's about where women what sectors they want to work and so on. But I think when you look at a particular sector, and specifically at a particular company, we need to have transparency, right? To me, it's completely inconceivable a company that discriminates on the basis of gender, discriminates. You need to discriminate perhaps on the basis of performance, right? I mean, strong performance go up, but that has nothing to do with gender. And I think one way to combat it is to just make it obvious, right? Okay, let's disclose. We asked at some point publicly traded companies, they need to disclose certain information. Why can we not increase that level of transparency and disclosure so that at least things become a lot more obvious, right? As opposed to opaque and difficult to figure out what's happening. So I think there's a lot that's within companies' controls and CEOs and boards to, hopefully through that, then make it obvious that things do need to change.
So this is, again, surprisingly, as David was saying, the survey said that this is not high on the agenda of women and men as much as the promotion and access. And I think that it has to do a bit with where we are in the journey in the region, which is why you're seeing globally that pay equity is more of a topic, because you now hopefully had more opportunities. I think that's where governments again play a role. So in the UK, all companies that have a threshold with a number of employees and I think a revenue have to report their pay gap. That's why we have this information around investment bankers. That's why you're seeing all of this data in the market that's causing a lot of controversy. And actually the WEF has come back with to 100 years to close that pay gap. So I think these conversations need to be had. I think also the perception is that in government work, especially in the UAE, and Saudi, there isn't that much of a pay gap. We don't have information around this, but that's the perception because women are entering the workforce that are very educated and up to speed to things. So I think definitely there needs to be more dialogue around this, and that's the only way you can overcome and start talking about it. But we don't have reporting from a Middle East perspective. There's not a lot of companies that do that. But there are a lot of discussions happening behind the scenes where I sit on a D&I council for the region, and a lot of the D&I leaders are talking about carrying out their own exercise internally. And so I think that's a great first step. It's a baby step, but it's a great first step.
And dear audience, please note that we just had the UK come up in a conversation here as a positive example. That's something that doesn't happen very often at the moment in discussions at the World Economic Forum or otherwise. I know we run out of time, very un-Swiss of me, but one last point of order. Where can our audience find this report? Which website would we go to read the whole report?
It's on the PwC website.
PwC main website.
I
I've
think
also seen it on your Twitter account.
Yes.
So folks, go and check out the report.
So it's, to give you the precise, it's the www.pwc.com/me/women in work.
There you go. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for being here. And thank you to my panelists.
Thank you.